Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be our section 6.3 lecture, and we're going to look at what biodiversity is and how we can see it in different ecosystems, as well as how it benefits us and how it helps keep ecosystems resilient. So first of all, just the idea of what biodiversity actually is. When we look at biodiversity, what we're looking at is the total of all genetically based variation in every single organism in the entire biosphere. So we're really looking at a large scale, and we're looking at really just every single organism, all the different genetic variations that we see in every single species across the entire biosphere. So we're just really looking at kind of all the diversity, all the variations and differences. Now, there's three types of biodiversity: ecosystem, species, and genetic, and we're going to go ahead and look at those a little bit closer as to what they specifically are looking at. When we look at ecosystem diversity, what we're looking at is diversity or variation of the habitats, the different communities, and the different ways that the ecosystems work, the different ecological processes in our biosphere. So how our different biological processes are occurring in our different communities, how nutrients are being recycled, etc. So ecosystem diversity, we're looking at more of the ecosystem level, the differences of habitats and communities in those ecosystems. Now, when we look at species diversity, okay, species diversity, again, diversity just means the variation. So we're just looking at the number of different species that are either in the biosphere, or we might look at a specific area. Just depends on what level we want to look at. But really, again, we're just looking at kind of all the different species that are present in whatever area it is that we're studying. Okay, and right now we have biologists have about named 1.8 million species, and realistically they think that there's still about 30 million that have yet to even be discovered. So we still have a lot of work to do on looking at the variety and the diversity of species we have in our world. Now, genetic diversity, this is a little bit different. Genetic diversity is where we're going to look at the sum total, okay, all of the different forms of genetic information, or DNA, if you think of it that way, that is carried by a particular species or by all the organisms on Earth in the biosphere. Okay, so genetic diversity, it sounds very similar to biodiversity, but when we're talking about biodiversity, okay, biodiversity is always looking at everything in the biosphere. Okay. If we're talking about genetic diversity, it could vary depending on what we're studying. So it could be by a particular species, could be with a particular area, or it could go on the larger scale and be looking at the biosphere. Okay, but realistically, we're looking at all of the genetic information and the different forms that we may have and the different varieties. This is definitely the hardest one for scientists to be able to see and study. It takes a lot more work, a lot more technology to analyze that DNA and to see those variations. Now, why biodiversity is important to us? Okay, biodiversity is really something that benefits our society. It includes contributions to medicine, agriculture, and to the healthy structure and stability of ecosystems. So we talked a little bit in the last section about keystone species and other organisms that helps keep those ecosystems stable, okay, and that is part of biodiversity. When we lose biodiversity, okay, we see a big significant value in our biosphere be lost. Okay, also for us as humans, we lose a really big significant part of these benefits and contributions that we've had with medicine and agriculture. So really, it's really crucial that we go ahead and try to conserve the biodiversity throughout our biosphere. And we're going to look at kind of the values of it in this section. And then the last part of our chapter, we're going to look at what things are threatening biodiversity. And more importantly, what are the human threats that we're doing that are decreasing the biodiversity in our Earth. All right, now some interesting things, biodiversity in medicine. So biodiversity has allowed for some really, really neat ways to introduce medicine. There are some wild species, okay, some different wild species that we've seen be able to produce medicine that has helped us. There is what's called a foxglove plant, and it has compounds within it that is used actually to treat heart disease. So we were able to go ahead and look at this variation of a plant and see that there were some chemical compounds in it that were going to be able to be used to make this heart disease medicine. Also really interesting, a lot of venom is used in medical treatment. So both bee and ant venom is actually being used for medicine for arthritis. And this is actually a bee treatment right now. So they're doing kind of a medical treatment where the bees are actually stinging into the joint, and that venom's going directly into that knee joint. Something else that venom is being used for, so snake venom, this is kind of how they collect it. They allow that snake to kind of pretend bite into something, and then the venom releases into the cup. They're using snake venom to go ahead and make a blood pressure medicine. So really some interesting different ways that the diverse organisms that we have on our planet being used in our benefit to produce some really great medicines. Biodiversity in agriculture. So really, really important when we look at agriculture and we look at the crop plants that are being grown. A lot of these plants have wild relatives. So these are all different variations of potatoes. There's also different variations of corn. But what this does is when we have all these different wild plants, is we can go ahead and look at the genes that these plants carry. Okay, we go ahead and look at their DNA. And we can go ahead and genetically engineer, okay, so that the plants that we're using in crops have genes that maybe the wild plants have that are really beneficial. So things like pest resistance, we've been able to find in wild plants and then take that DNA and put it into the crop potatoes or crop plants that we're trying to grow. Okay, so the wild variations, we can go ahead and look at their DNA and see, are there any genes that maybe are really beneficial that our crop plants don't have, such as disease resistance and pest resistance, and then we're able to go ahead and genetically engineer our crop plants to have those genes. So without that variation, we would definitely have crop plants that would be more susceptible to disease and pests. Now, biodiversity and healthy ecosystems. So the number and the variety of species that we have in an ecosystem definitely directly influences the ecosystem's stability, its productivity, how well it works, and its value to us. Okay, so when we talked about the keystone species and we talked about that otter and how it helps stabilize that ecosystem so that the sea urchins are not overpopulating and therefore causing the kelp to go ahead and decrease. Okay, that's really important. That allows for the stability and the productivity. If we didn't have the biodiversity of those organisms, okay, then that stability of that ecosystem would likely decrease. Okay, so healthy, diverse ecosystems really play an important role in keeping then kind of the entire ecosystem, such as the soil, the water, the air quality, at its most productive form. So keeping as many organisms, as most biodiversity as possible in an ecosystem really helps the stability overall and helps maintain a healthy ecosystem. So that is also key when we look at the value of biodiversity. Now, biodiversity and ecosystem resilience. So when we talk about the word resilience, okay, if you're resilient or an ecosystem is resilient, that just means that that ecosystem is able to recover, okay, after there's been a disturbance. So if you're a resilient person, you can recover quickly after being sick. If an ecosystem is resilient, okay, what it talks about is the ecosystem's ability to recover after there's been maybe a major disturbance. So the way that biodiversity affects this is the more biodiversity there is in that ecosystem, okay, the more variety of species and genetic differences, the more resilient it's likely to be. So if we see more biodiversity, the quicker that ecosystem should be able to recover after we see a disturbance occur. Okay, so that's really a big thing with biodiversity and keeping those ecosystems healthy. One example would be if we only had, say, one genetic type of corn, one variation of corn. If a disease hit that specific genetic variation of corn, it would wipe out all of our corn crops. Okay, so what we have to look at is farmers actually go ahead and plant varieties and different genetic forms of corn so that if there was something to hit just one of those genetic varieties, there still is then the capability for the other corn to continue to grow and so that they still have their crops. Okay, so the more variety there is, the less of a chance that a disturbance is going to hit everything. Right, now the last part is just some ecosystem services. So when we talk about ecosystem services, we're talking about the different benefits that ecosystems provide to us. So things like purifying water, okay, our ecosystems, the different reservoirs that we have, okay, it helps purify our water, helps go ahead and filter out our water, and helps with those water purification systems. Okay, another one is pollinating. Okay, pollinating bees, flies, butterflies are so crucial in pollinating our crop plants, okay, and fruit trees and vegetables. Okay, we really rely on those pollinators, and that's a huge thing with the looking at the bees that are really becoming endangered, and we have to worry about what would happen if our bee species were to go extinct. Okay, we would be losing a major pollinator for us. Obviously, food production, nutrient cycling. Think about what we talked about with our nutrients cycling in chapter 3 and 4. Okay, how that bacteria is going to help fix that nitrogen process. Okay, we have to have all those variations of bacteria to be able to do that for us so that nitrogen is usable. Okay, regulating pests. Okay, although I don't like them, bats are huge with regulating pests. Okay, they go ahead and help take care of mosquitoes and things and different insects that could, if they weren't there, really overgrow their population. So just some really different things that having biodiversity in our ecosystems really provides a lot of benefits to us humans. Okay, so that really goes ahead and helps us overall, but unfortunately we are actually the ones that are typically causing the reduction in biodiversity in our ecosystems. And we'll look at that in the next section. All right, otherwise, if you have any questions, make sure you ask in class, and we'll go over some different things with the ecosystem biodiversity within our activities.